Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I just wanted to do a quick rundown of the books I read in March. Apologies in advance, my voice is a little bit sore at the moment. I'm a little bit ill. All fine, I'll be fine. But I just wanted to go through some of the books I have read over this month. And apparently, again, according to Goodreads, I've read 27 books this month, which again is somewhat baffling. But that said, a large number of them, at least half of them, were audiobooks, which has been a massive help because at some points in this month, I just could not really read and my brain was just not working with me on that. So that aside, let's go through all of the books that I have read so far this month. So starting off, the first book I read was Boundless Sea by David Abulafia. Now this book is about 1,000 pages long, so the audiobook was something like 40 hours, and it's basically the history of the world told through the sea and told through oceans and kind of peoples who lived by the sea. So for example, we start off looking at kind of tribal communities or kind of people who lived in kind of on kind of islands and how they kind of slowly grew kind of the area that they knew and the kind of the space that they lived in, from being able to kind of be seafaring people. So kind of starting off around kind of the Maori people of New Zealand, of what's currently New Zealand. And yeah, kind of lots of really interesting things from there. So it's quite fascinating because, you know, sort of once you get to kind of World War II and kind of a lot around empire and all those kinds of things, you're also, you know, by that point you're a large amount into the history of the world. But what's sort of so fascinating is just to kind of see how much David Abulafia weaves in stories of, you know, where people were, how they kind of traveled across land, and how essentially if conditions had been different, if people were either less able to travel across water or more able at various points, or indeed if they were in sort of more landlocked areas, history could have been so different. And it's fascinating just to kind of see that kind of across the whole way. I probably would recommend the audiobook just because I think 1,000 pages of reading it sort of physically might be quite a lot. And also I think it's just quite nice to let it wash over you. But I can also imagine this is quite a nice book to kind of dip into bit, you know, every so often, you know, little bits at a time, because it's just so fascinating to see the whole history of the world done in that way. I mean, it's an ambitious goal and an ambitious idea, right, to kind of look at the history of the world in any sense, but particularly just kind of doing it through the ocean and through water is quite special. So I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really quite brilliant. And it was just nice to just let that all happen and kind of just be able to enjoy it for what it was. Next up were two audiobooks that I listened to in quite quick succession because they're both very short, and those are The Lost Spells and Lost Words by Jackie Morris and Robert Macfarlane. So essentially these were in response to the kind of a children's dictionary a few years back that was taking out some of the words related to various parts of nature, because it was felt that many children wouldn't know those words and wouldn't necessarily encounter them. And some of them were kind of a bit more obscure, you know, things that don't come up that often, but some of them were words that, you know, actually are quite, I wouldn't say common, but, you know, like they're not particularly these big esoteric nature words. So words like bramble, for example, where actually for me that doesn't seem that alien a word, and I grew up in South London, but like I also realized that I went out in nature quite a lot as a child, and so perhaps that's also part of it. So this was kind of aimed as a response. So Lost Words was initially about putting these words back out there, and finding ways to engage with them, and, you know, kind of talking a bit about the magic of them. And that was followed up by The Lost Spells, which is all about casting nature in this idea of, you know, really talking about the magic and joy and beauty of nature. I adored both of them. I probably is just someone who already loves nature writing anyway, and loves when there's something that kind of captures the fascination and joy that can be found around nature. For me, those are all really powerful, brilliant things, and so I absolutely adored it. But I think at the same time, it's one of those. I mean, I had these as audiobooks, which made they were very short. Meant they were very short, and actually, it's kind of partly for that reason I was nervous about whether to log them as books I'd listen to, because the audiobooks are like an hour each, and that feels like nothing. But at the same time, I thought I'd count them just because I wanted a chance to talk about them. And there's another audiobook later that I purposely left out as a kind of recompense, as kind of balancing for that, which was by what was it? Jonathan Franzen, something about pretending. What happened if we stopped pretending? Something like that. I will add that in the notes later when I work out what exactly I meant by that. Next up was C.P. Snow with In Their Wisdom, and I was reading this as part of a Booker Prize shortlist, the 1974 Booker Prize shortlist to be more exact. And this is a sort of legal drama-ish, and I thought this started in quite a promising way. I was really quite excited because essentially, some of the early chapters are all taking place inside a courtroom, and so you've got that really kind of quick and snappy back and forth between people, with kind of some characters being kind of cross-examined and all those kinds of things, and that lends itself really well to being really dramatic and really fun. And I was sort of watching How to Get Away with Murder alongside it, so for me, I was like, oh, this is really exciting. And then it kind of, for me, failed to kind of deliver on that promise a little bit. It kind of started to round off a little bit, and there were kind of quite a few characters introduced who I just didn't really care about. The whole kind of thing at the heart of it is that there are characters who are all desperately trying to get some money from somebody who's pardon me, who's recently died. And where at first I thought this was a really great kind of idea, it kind of then didn't really go anywhere for me. There were just too many characters who I didn't really care about, and I just found them all a bit anyway. But I'm sure, I think as well, it felt very old-fashioned, and I do wonder as well at the time whether it would have kind of just been seen differently. I mean obviously it must have been, because it got onto the shortlist, and obviously I am one opinion of many, but it was a book that just didn't really work for me, unfortunately. And I think, yeah, there are other Booker Prize shortlist books I've enjoyed a little bit more, perhaps. Next up was another Booker Prize shortlisted book. This is going to happen more now because I'm actually finally getting around to books that I borrowed from the library a long time ago that I should really give back when they reopen, which were mostly Booker Prize shortlisted ones. Anyway, so the next thing I read was The Electric Michelangelo by Sarah Hall. I haven't really read anything of hers before, but she was longlisted for the Booker once, which I've not read the other one of hers, but she does a lot of short story writing and is kind of really beloved as a short story writer. For me, the Electric Michelangelo started off, I don't know. So the whole idea, I should probably talk about what the idea of the novel is first, but it's largely around this kind of community of people kind of operating around circuses, and kind of the main kind of central characters are, or a few of the main central characters are tattooists, one of whom brands himself as the Electric Michelangelo, hence the title of the book. And so there's a lot kind of around the kind of circusy seaside town kind of feel, kind of the kind of freaks and the kind of underbelly of kind of society and kind of the ways that they do things. So for him, tattooing, particularly at a time that kind of time is sort of still sort of early 1900s, and it's seen as like this really almost taboo thing in some ways, at least definitely compared to now. And yeah, so really kind of interesting to see how it all kind of slotted together. And I do think it started off in a way that I couldn't really engage with. And then I occasionally would find moments where I just thought, oh, this is brilliant. I love the way this is written. And then I would kind of I think it's also partly sometimes, what you bring to a book as well as a reader. And I think sometimes I wasn't the right reader for this book, and I was perhaps also a bit too tired for bits of it. So I don't think I necessarily took in as much as I should have. This is also the problem with reading shortlisted books, and knowing that I have to read them, is if I'm not enjoying them. Whereas with other books, I might sort of set them down for a little bit and then come back to them. With a Booker Prize one, I'm like, no, I must continue and I must do this. And yeah, and that sometimes can mean whatever. But anyway, I didn't necessarily love it, but I think there was so much brilliance about it. I love so much about the way she writes about some of these scenarios. She's very good for capturing the kind of the characters who are sort of on the underbelly of society. And yeah, there's some really absolutely beautiful descriptions. There's one section where she talks about, in very few pages, talks about the decline of seaside towns and how, you know, people start wanting to go abroad, or how people become quite desensitized to the shock and horror of a kind of P.T. Barnum style freak show, and how, you know, how originally, you know, seeing the muscled woman or like the bearded lady or whatever, all these kind of freak show kind of things, how originally, you know, people were so sort of shocked and appalled by it and kept on coming back to get more, you know, to go again and again. But then even just a year later, sometimes people are like, oh no, I've seen that. I've been shocked enough. And, you know, with the advent of things like TV as well, sort of saying that, you know, why would people pay to go out and see a real thing like this when actually they could see far more shocking things on the TV on a regular basis. So I thought it was an interesting book, and that section especially I thought was so well captured. You know, in probably about 3 or 4 pages, she manages to shift, you know, the whole kind of time forward of over kind of the television age dawning and what that means for everyone around, and the kind of devastation it wreaks on kind of certain neighborhoods. So I just thought it was really well done. Next up, I read Between Worlds, A Queer Boy from the Valleys by Jeffrey Weeks. So this is his memoir, which I think is out in May, and I kind of read it as an advance copy. Now, Jeffrey Weeks has gotten me out of many a tricky situation during university essays, during my undergrad. He is a kind of queer historian. Sorry, my phone is buzzing over here. Anyway, there we go. So he's a queer historian who writes a lot about particularly kind of the history of sexuality, or the history of LGBTQ rights and the way that they've been fought for. Again, this is why he was such a great person for my university essays, because sometimes you just need someone to say this thing happened and be able to quote someone, and Jeffrey Weeks is always there. But this is his own memoir, so he kind of is speaking a lot about kind of his own history growing up in the Rhondda in South Wales, in the Welsh sort of valleys, and how that was for him as someone who was gay, and particularly during that kind of time, sort of, you know, kind of 60s, 70s, I think it was. So, you know, he was kind of coming into his own as sort of being like a young adult, you know, sort of late teens, early 20s, I think by that point in London, when so much of the kind of queer activism was happening. So he was kind of right there during some of the earliest pride marches and some of the earliest activism meetings that are, you know, kind of higher profile ones that we owe a lot to now. And it's interesting seeing his perspective on all of that, particularly as he was sort of trying to, so this is a really interesting memoir for that reason, because it's partly the situation, like the global situation and sort of national situation of LGBTQ rights and the kind of history of that, and he kind of can't help as a historian from kind of jumping in with bits around that, but also his own personal history, and him kind of finding his own identity, him looking after a lover. There's a really sort of tender moment where he's sort of looking after this lover who is slowly dying, sort of during the AIDS crisis, and it's a poignant moment, absolutely stunning. I think the only thing that kind of rankled with me a little bit with this book is occasionally it does sort of feel like he's wanting to settle the score with some academics who he had fallings out with, or, you know, heads of department. And occasionally, like, Jeffrey, you don't need this in this book. Like, this book can just be you talking about sort of finding yourself as a gay man, and the kind of complications of things around you. But I still thought it was really beautiful, and really powerful, and I'm excited for when it comes out, just for Jeffrey Weeks to kind of get another sort of wave of love, as kind of a really interesting queer historian who's really documented a lot about UK queer history. Next up is Gurl, Gurl by Kenya. This is now where, because I've got Goodreads up in one corner and I can't fully see the title from here. By Kenya Hunt. There we go. I couldn't see her surname. And this book is with sort of subtitled "On Womanhood and Belonging in the Age of Black Girl Magic." And I thought this book was really interesting. So she talks a lot in this book about her identity as a black woman, and kind of there are a couple of sort of guest essays and moments as well during it. But it's sort of talking. So it starts kind of part of where the title comes in. Is it starts by talking about, you know, sort of black women using Gurl amongst each other as a kind of a, you know, in various ways to kind of be like, girl, you've got this, or like, girl, don't do that kind of thing. And how that's sort of been oddly appropriated by other people, particularly by white people, in a way that kind of feels quite strange to her. And then it kind of goes from there into a lot of really interesting discussions about what it means to be a black woman. So, for example, people telling her how to pronounce her name, because, you know, her name Kenya, people keep on telling her, oh, are you sure it isn't Kenya? And all these kinds of things, and sort of saying, how can you be called Kenya if you've never been to Kenya? And all these kinds of things. And, you know, about black women in fashion and in the fashion industry, and how there are sort of so many other sort of struggles and challenges and things like that. So I thought it was really powerfully done, and really interesting. Yeah, and just such a fresh voice, something that I wasn't really expecting. I just sort of saw it on kind of, I think it was on Libby or on BorrowBox, and just thought like, yeah, why not try this out? Really interesting book, and I think it's read by her, or I think she does at least some of the reading during for the audiobook, which is really cool as well. Next up is Luster, which I won't talk about too much because I did a separate video on that. So you've heard my thoughts on that. But Luster by Raven Leilani, I just think is such a stunning novel. I loved how acerbic and sharp and witty and warm it was. I know that there are some people who have issues with the kind of how coincidental things are in the book, and that is, you know, I was happy to overlook it, but I totally get why that's something that some people might have an issue with. But I thought overall it was just such a beautiful, incredible, striking debut, which has now been longlisted for the Women's Prize, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was also longlisted for the Booker. I just think it's a great book, and I'm really excited for more people to read it. Next up is a book that I kept on hearing a lot of buzz around, and then purely coincidentally found, like saw come up, I think on Libby again, as an audiobook, and that is Girl A by Abigail Dean. So this is interesting because I assumed that I wouldn't, I kind of assumed that this is a book that I might read towards the end of the year if it was in library, if I sort of found it by sort of chance in a library, or, you know, if it was not shortlisted for the Booker, because on first sort of look, I didn't think it was my kind of book. It's kind of it's sort of written about or referred to a bit as a kind of thriller kind of thing, or sort of cell thing, but it involves these 7 siblings who have been abused, and have kind of, you know, grown up together during this abuse, and them kind of now as adults trying to reconcile what to do, particularly as now their parents are dead, and they have to work out what to do with the estate. And so Girl A, the kind of the protagonist really of this whole book, is going around sort of checking in with each of the siblings to kind of work out what to do about settling their mother's estate. And, you know, there are talks about turning the house that they grew up in and were abused in into some kind of sort of centre to kind of look after young people, and it's really interesting, kind of, because it delves into then dealing with issues of you know, trauma and forgiveness, and, you know, if forgiveness is even possible. The siblings all have kind of complicated relationships with each other. They've all been sent to various parts of the UK to kind of live, you know, to kind of, they had their childhoods in different parts of the UK and were encouraged not to be in touch. You know, they were with different sort of foster families, and it was considered that if they spent too much time together, that would be quite negative for them, because that would bring up a lot of the trauma. You know, it was an attempt to give them a new normal life, as much as that's possible for them. And so it's interesting because we go through sort of it's split into sort of sections for each of the different children. And, you know, one of them was really young when all of this was happening, and so barely remembers anything, whereas some of the other ones were part of it, and some of them were encouraged to act abusively to others, or they were kind of stopped from being able to support each other. So I was really surprised. This is just a book that I kind of thought I'd give a bit of a go as an audiobook, because it's one of those, although it didn't initially sound like the kind of book I'd really enjoy, it was getting rave reviews in a way that made me kind of pay a little bit of attention to it, and I'm really glad I listened to it. I thought it was really powerful, really stunning, some brilliant writing. I thought it was really tense and taut all the way through. It didn't I mean, I sometimes have a bit of an issue with um, books about kind of abuse, in that sometimes, I mean, I've read ones before where it's felt like tragedy porn, where it's felt like it's been written in a way that's so kind of, I don't know, it's been written in a way that's very kind of exploitative, perhaps. And I didn't get that feeling here. Instead, I got the feeling that this was really well thought out, really cleverly done. It really explored the feelings of those characters, but also didn't. We weren't ever meant to sort of sit there and pity them. We were meant to kind of read it through an idea of, you know, this gripping story about how these characters are dealing with their lives in sort of modern times now after everything has happened. So I thought it was really interesting. And yeah, I think it's well worth checking out. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if this sort of troubles a few of the prize things this year, yeah, prize lists this year. It's one of those kind of silent kind of sleeper hits almost, I think, where on the surface it kind of seems like it'd be a bit populist and a bit whatever, which seems really snobby, I realise, but I think it's got such quality and depth to it, and I think it's really interesting. So yeah, I think it's well worth checking out. The next book I read was another advanced copy, and that was, and this is now where I get the name up again, this was Hyphen by Pardis Mahdavi, and this was just a short little book, sort of about 150 to 200 pages long, all about the history of the hyphen and kind of the personal and sort of etymological and sort of grammatical history of the hyphen. So if I could, which at first doesn't sound like it would be the most exciting thing, but I think this is, we've woven together really well. So a key part of the idea around this is, you know, American identities have for a really long time been hyphenated. So, for example, African American, Asian American, and part of this is also pulling up the fact that we never really talk about European American. For example, it's, you know, people may occasionally say Italian American or Irish American, but, you know, it's, firstly, kind of some identities are seen as divisive, and there was a period of time where there was a lot of discussion around hyphens, and how if you hyphenated someone and said, you know, I'm Italian American, for example, that was seen as dangerous to the idea of being American, because you weren't fully putting your foot in one camp. You were kind of straddling both and saying, oh, I'm both Italian and American at the same time. And that was seen as dangerous in some point in history to the idea of being American. And so many people were just encouraged to just give up any notion of where their family had roots, and were instead kind of meant to just be American. And I think this book does some really interesting things to kind of unveil that. And it also talks about other hyphenated identities. So it talks, for example, about people who the sort of a Latin America, it follows kind of different people. So the author herself is Iranian American, and talks about how, particularly when Iran, you know, Iran and the US have had a really fraught history, and so when she goes to Iran, she's seen as American, but to many Americans she's seen as Iranian, and how that's really quite problematic for her, and she's kind of forced to give one up. And also, I thought something else that was super interesting about this was, you know, it followed, for example, a trans character, and how their kind of their kind of search for identity through various parts of sexuality and gender identity leave them with various hyphenated parts to their identity throughout. So sometimes if they're seeing themselves as a trans woman, then I mean, although that's no longer hyphenated, at some point that would perhaps have been, and so kind of there's a lot of talk about the hyphen being the bridge between, like, is that a divide between two identities, or the bridge between two identities that brings them together? And it kind of weaves in alongside in the background some history about the use of the hyphen, and that's kind of what drew me to this. I just thought it was kind of quite an interesting idea to kind of focus in on a grammatical point, but in a way that was quite personal, and so yeah, I thought it was really quite cool. Next up was The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. Now, I read this for a book club that I'm part of, and it is all the idea of a kind of future civilization, and that's kind of following on from the Vietnam War. So Joe Haldeman himself was fought in the Vietnam War and then wanted to write a sci-fi novel that spoke about the horrors he'd seen there. And so this follows this idea of a war that is kind of ongoing and nobody's really quite sure why it happened or what have you. And there's a kind of sort of thing where when they go and fight in space, time moves very differently. So he thinks he's only been away for a few months, but actually many, many years have passed on Earth. And when he comes back, things have changed quite dramatically. And that, you know, that's quite an exciting premise. I thought it was a really cool idea for a book. I think overall it didn't work for me as a book, because partly I think I'm you know, as much as I'm up for trying sci-fi and fantasy and sort of other things, for me, at times I felt like I was just reading pages of someone telling me about how the physics worked in a scenario. And I think that's less a sci-fi thing and more just a writing thing. I have issues with people kind of telling me everything in a book. I kind of just want to discover it and I want to feel it. I also think that, I mean, I know that people have sort of defended him on this, but there are also some, for me, slightly problematic things around sexuality in the book. It's kind of seen as like a very, because at one point everyone's gay and it's dealt with in a way that's like, for me, that feels like it's kind of mutable, that at any stage they could just kind of flick the switch and go back to being happy, straight, normal people. And that for me, it sat a bit uncomfortably and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. So yeah. But I think aside from that, I mean, it was interesting. I just don't think it's necessarily the kind of book for me. I'm glad I read it though. I think it's interesting because it's such a sci-fi classic. And so I'm glad I read that. There we go. So, next then we have I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya, which is a kind of short essay, and it deals with Vivek Shraya's own kind of understanding of their sexuality and gender. And so, for example, when Vivek kind of talks about kind of transitioning, there are so many kind of complicated aspects of their identity that come into play. So the fact that they are a person of color, I think they're in Canada, and sort of their experiences as a gay man of color first in, or at least being seen that way in Canada, and then after they transition, also being kind of how people kind of connect the dots with someone who doesn't fit the kind of typical thing that they're used to seeing. So in many LGBTQ circles, particularly in gay male circles, it can often be very, very white. And, you know, Vivek is sort of talking about standing out there, but also kind of after transition and a few other kind of moments. Yeah, so I thought it was super interesting, really well written and really powerfully done. I kind of almost wanted more of it. I think that was my only criticism of it, is I kind of wanted this to be a tiny bit longer just to get even more of what was going on. But I mean, so well written and so interesting, nonetheless. The next up is The Discomfort of Evening by, and this is where I butcher their name, this is by Marieke Lucas Rijneveld, who, and translated by Michelle Hutchinson, who was the first non-binary winner of the International Booker Prize, and of any Booker Prize as far as I'm aware. So this is a book all about, this one last year, and this is all about a young girl, Yaz, who is growing up in a small kind of farm town in the Netherlands. It's kind of a very religious community, and it's a lot about their kind of understanding of shame and of kind of the world around them. So they're kind of a really young protagonist, I think about 9 years old, and so they don't understand a lot of the world around them and why things are happening, and things are quite brutal and violent in parts. I think when this won last year, I saw a lot of people kind of being like, sorry, what? Of all the books on the shortlist, this one? Okay, this was for many people the book in the shortlist that they hated. And having now read it, I kind of see it. For me, I didn't really warm to this book ever. I think as much as it can be really interesting having a young protagonist, I often can find it quite tricky to really like them unless it's done in with kind of something else to back it up. So for example, Room by Emma Donoghue I think does this brilliantly. Atonement by Ian McEwan I think also does this brilliantly, of having a young child narrate a book, but because it has to be kind of done with a little bit of artistic license of kind of some things around them to kind of make it clear what the world is for everybody else. Whereas I think for this, I just couldn't really ever warm to her point of view. Yeah, I never really, and I think I think Simon Savage at Savage Reads and Tom at Tom Reads Things, I believe, spoke a bit about that. They refer to this as the cheesy poo book, and I entirely see why, because there's a lot of part of the discomfort that's mentioned in the book is characters having various forms of like indigestion, and because they basically have a diet that is almost always like almost all like cheese and meat and whatever else, and so they're constantly constipated basically, and that's part of their discomfort. And I didn't really warm to it. That kind of never really, for me, that always threw me off. Just when there was something that I thought was really well written or really emotional or really a really clever way of phrasing something or of thinking of something, I got really put off by like, oh, okay, no, we're just gonna have another lengthy description of someone like pulling poo out, and occasionally as well it was sort of followed up by some things that felt quite abusive and some things that were quite messed up. So yeah, I don't know, and I, as much as those things have a place in books to be discussed, and you know they're part of human life, and I guess there's a way that you can discuss them in books that kind of talks about things that happen within that, I just found it really uncomfortable, and I guess that's partly the point. But for me, that discomfort, hence the title, that discomfort never really felt like something I wanted to stick with, to kind of gain something else. I just found it all just quite puerile, and yeah, I just didn't really like it. There we go. Next up, on a very different note, I read Brown Baby by Nikesh Shukla. So Nikesh Shukla collected together a set of essays before called, I believe, The Good Immigrant, which are all about kind of discussing what it is like for people who are sort of various stages of immigrant to the UK, so second, third generation, whatever, and just sort of people of colour in the UK, what their experience was like of being in the UK, and kind of the racism they faced, and being told that they, you know, should feel grateful to be in the country and all those kinds of things. And Brown Baby is Nikesh Shukla talking, like writing some sort of letters and sort of essays and things to his daughters, particularly one daughter, about his kind of hopes and fears for them in the future. So, for example, his fears about them growing up and sort of realizing having their bubble burst about racism in the UK, for example, but also some really touching moments about, you know, remembering family and remembering roots, and, you know, all those kinds of things. And I think just throughout this, it's so touchingly done. Nikesh Shukla is really unafraid to be really quite vulnerable, you know, talking about his own fears, his struggles with weight and with eating, his kind of struggles with grief after his mother died. I just think this is such a stunning book, and yeah, I just think it was really lovely. I really respect an author who can dig that deep and be so vulnerable so openly, but also make it funny and make it really interesting, and really quite educational in terms of, you know, an experience of being, you know, someone with Indian family living in the UK. What does that look like? You know, what are his feelings towards India? And it's quite a complicated history and quite a complicated relationship. So I thought it was really well done. Yeah, and I really liked it. Then, next up, I read The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon. So I've read another book of his before, the name of which now has completely escaped me, but I will remember it as we go. And this book is all about, essentially, as with the other book, The Housing Lark, as with The Housing Lark, which was all about the kind of a sort of Windrush generation in the UK, all kind of struggling to make ends meet and to kind of get everything sorted, and then their kind of lives sort of living in London. The Lonely Londoners kind of follows with a very sort of similar theme, and it's kind of these characters, particularly from the Caribbean, kind of talking about their life in London, and kind of how they get on and kind of the racism they face, but also the joy and strength they find in each other. And just, I think it's really quite a refreshing book in so many ways, because it it's kind of weird. It's a novel that I'm kind of surprised in some ways that Sam Selvon's work has only recently sort of been reissued and kind of spoken about, because really I don't think in the 60s, at least that I'm aware of, at least that were kind of given a sort of a big amount of sort of support and fame, as it were. I don't think there were that many books that really focused on what it was like for kind of people recently arriving in the UK and kind of their experiences. You know, these are kind of people who are often written about, as opposed to kind of being given the space to be able to write about themselves. And so for me, this is just quite an interesting book, just to kind of get that sense of it. And a lot of it's written in dialect and sort of in accents. And so it's fascinating kind of hearing this other London that is so often left out, you know. So I think it's really interesting. I think I maybe prefer The Housing Lark, but The Lonely Londoners I think was still really interesting and really fun. And it's a really short book as well, so you know, you can kind of really whiz through it. I think I did. I think I read the whole thing in a couple of hours. But yeah, really interesting and really fun and well worth checking out. So those have been some of the first ones. I'm going to sort of split this in two again here, I think, because otherwise I could ramble for bloody ages. So let's pause that there for the moment, and then I'll come back to some more of the books that I have read this month.